name is Mats Rinaldo. I'm a researcher at Group Research and Development at DNV. I intend to talk to you about the energy transition Norway today. And the Energy Transition Outlook reports are a number of regional and global reports that we produce where we try to capture and explain how the energy transition will unfold all the way to 2060. And Norway is no exception. If we look at Norway, we see a nation up in the far north, tightly connected to Europe and to the rest of the world. So what I'd like to do is to explain how we have modeled Norway in combination with Europe and how that affects Norway, the energy transition, as well as how the energy transition of the world affects Norway. And we will do that towards 2060, 35 years away. However, before I go forward 35 years, I want to go back a little bit and explain the history of Norway. So the history of Norway as an energy nation, you could say it's faced by abundance and independence. So take the left-hand picture, for example, oil and gas exploration. It's about 50 years ago in the 1970s where we had the first flow of oil from the Norwegian continental shelf. And we today export a large amount of hydrocarbons to the rest of the world, primarily Europe. And then the right-hand picture, you can see a hydropower plant. So over 100 years ago, Norway started to build hydropower plants and has exceeded with cheap electricity in abundance. So that has been the history. And then if we look forward, how are things going to look? The left-hand picture here shows Norwegian energy exports. They are signified by oil exports as well as gas exports. And as you can see, starting in the 80s from a relatively low volume, then growing to the 2000s, and then up until today, we've had a sustained high level of hydrocarbon exports. Going forward into the future, we see a significant decline by almost 80% towards 2060. And that has, of course, huge impacts for Norway, economics, but also activity levels and its role as an energy exporter in the world. That was the long term. If we look at the right-hand picture, you can see that that is a little bit more short term. That shows the net electricity exports in Norway. And Norway is connected to the Nordic grid with interconnectors to both Netherlands, Germany, and UK, and of course trades with electricity every day, every hour. Norway sustained a net surplus for a number of years, between 10 to 20 terawatt hours. However, going forward, the next 5 years will be very challenging. We see a significant shift where we early in the 2030s will shift from a net surplus to a net deficit. And overall, this wouldn't be necessarily a bad thing. Many countries have this situation, and of course, it's possible to sustain electricity prices at a certain price point. But if it weren't for the fact that you need to produce new electricity, and new electricity is not as cheap as existing written-off hydropower. So I'll go through a number of sectors that will see a significant shift and explain how the energy system, electricity system in Norway will develop. Starting with a success story, I think we can see that electric vehicles in Norway has been very, very successful in deployment. If we look at the left-hand picture, you can see that the uptake of EV passenger vehicles is going fast, probably fastest in the world. And already by 2031, 50% of the vehicle fleet for passenger vehicles will be electric. For commercial vehicles, the time will take a little bit longer time, but also here we see a relative fast uptake. And by 2041, half of the commercial vehicle fleet will be electric. This has huge impacts for how much electricity and how much energy the transport sector uses. So looking at the right-hand side, you can see that there's a quick falling of fossil fuels, a combination of biofuels, but going forward, it's primarily electric energy that will sustain the electric vehicle fleet in Norway. But it is growing from relatively low levels to a significant share of road transport in the future. And again, this electricity has to come from somewhere. The second sector that I'd like to share is very much in the news today. It's the energy demand coming from data centers. And we see a fast uptake of data centers in Norway. Today, it's relatively modest, but it's growing fast, and towards 2060 will 18-fold. And it's primarily the relatively cheap electricity combined with good cooling and a stable geopolitical situation in Norway that makes it attractive for data center growth. So we think that Norway will grow faster than the rest of Europe in terms of its uptake of data center. The third sector that grows in its electricity demand is the Norwegian oil and gas production. Historically, we've had gas turbines on the rigs that have produced electricity and used natural gas for that purpose. In order to decarbonize and reduce its emissions, this is now being electrified, and it's a relatively fast electrification rate, as you can see on the left-hand picture, where we're passing around 50% of all Norwegian continental shelf activities electrified by a little bit after 2040. The fourth sector I'd like to introduce is around the manufacturing sector. Norway's manufacturing sector is traditionally very electrified, so you can see on the left-hand side that more than 50% of energy demand in the manufacturing sector is coming from electricity. And going forward, this will only increase. Fossil fuel declines. We see a little bit of an uptake in hydrogen, but long-term, both efficiency gains and relatively limited growth from the manufacturing sector will stabilize energy demand going forward. The fifth and the final sector that I introduce is on hydrogen. And we see hydrogen growing as an energy carrier, but it will only make up for about 5% of the final energy demand in 2060. It's both as for aviation as well as for shipping, but it's also to be used in manufacturing, steel industry, and also as a feedstock. As you can see on the right-hand side, about half of this hydrogen will come from electrolyzers, about 20% from steam reformed with CCS, and the rest will be based on natural gas. But this half of electrolyzers will, of course, need a lot of electricity. So we sum this up and we look at the different 5 sectors of growing electricity demand. You can see that we have transport sector is growing from relatively small to about 20 terawatt hours. Data centers growing almost to 30 terawatt hours in 2060. Oil and gas production is growing quickly, but then with activities on the Norwegian continental shelf slowing down, is reducing its electricity demand. And manufacturing has a quick uptake now to 2030-35, but after that it's flattening out, and we don't see necessarily a significant growth of electricity demand from manufacturing. And then finally, on the hydrogen production, you can see a growth from 0 today, or very, very limited, to about 15 terawatt hours in 2060. So taking this together, 3 of the first sectors, transport, data centers, and oil and gas production, they are relatively insensitive to price or price increases and are willing to pay for the electricity, since it's either necessary or cheaper or better than the alternative, or in the name of data centers, their value added is primarily through its services. Manufacturing and hydrogen production is extremely sensitive to the electricity prices, and thus that's the way that they manage to compete globally as well as with other energy sources. So where shall all this electricity come from? And when we're looking at the resources of Norway, we think that the only available, scalable technical solution that can produce any amount of electricity in the short to intermediate term, it's wind. And we see that falling costs in wind, as well as sustained government support for offshore wind, leads to wind build-out. And first of all, we see on the left-hand side that onshore wind in Norway is the cheapest form of electricity available today. Looking at fixed offshore wind, it's currently more expensive, but prices are coming down as cost learning curves improve, and we have expansion of fixed offshore wind in general. And then we have floating offshore wind, where there's a lot of opportunity for technology innovation and improvements of the cost. But as you can see today, floating offshore wind is significantly more expensive than other forms of wind. But looking at the installed capacity, you see a very limited growth of wind power in general in Norway. From 2020 to 2030, we see almost no capacity additions. And it's only after 2030 where we think wind, both onshore as well as offshore, will be built. For offshore, we have the initial 2 fields that are currently under development. We think this is going to take place, but then a few other wind projects offshore will happen, combined with improvement of the conditions for onshore wind. So looking at the overall picture for power generation in Norway, we see a relatively flat growth until 2030. Then from 2030, we see this net import necessary to sustain the electricity demand. And then when offshore and onshore wind again starts to come online, we have again a surplus of electricity in Norway. And this surplus will be sustained at relatively modest levels all the way to 2060. Solar will have a role to play, but it's relatively limited in combination with the other energy forms. And we've also looked at nuclear, where we think that nuclear will not be able to compete with other forms of electricity generation in the Norwegian energy mix. So this was some of the challenges that are facing Norway in the short term, short to intermediate term. In the longer term, we see a surplus and electricity prices coming down when wind has been rebuilt or built again. So from 2040 onwards, electricity prices will come down. But the challenge will be in the intermediate term for Norwegian industry to sustain its production and competitiveness with probably higher electricity prices. Looking at the longer term, as we started with, we see that oil and gas production will face a steady decline over the next 35 years. Today, Norway is spending about 60 billion US dollar in its state budget proposed for 2026. In revenue in 2024, the energy export revenue from oil and gas exports was around 110 billion US dollars. So currently, we're spending about half of that in the state budget. Looking forward, we see energy exports decline to around 20% of historical levels. And of course, extrapolating that means that the export revenue is in the line of perhaps 20 to 30 billion US dollars. So there's a significant deficit in the revenue versus the spending that will take place going forward. In addition, of course, it's about 200 to 250,000 people working in the oil and gas sector, which is important to consider. So going forward, Norway faces a challenge with declining oil and gas production. This forecast that we place here is relatively similar to what NPD or the Norwegian Sokkeldirektoratet is also forecasting in their medium trajectory. So it's based on existing and possible investment levels, but not foreseeing any particularly significant expansion of oil and gas exploration going forward. Important here is to capture that, of course, for Europe, this is a critical, important export that is necessary for Europe to sustain its gas imports. So today Norway is exporting or is providing about 30% of European natural gas, and going forward this will increase so that Norway is contributing to over half of Europe's natural gas in 2060, and thus being an extremely important exporter to Europe. So what is the impact of this energy transition finally when we consider the situation on emissions? As you can see in the background, this is Klemetsrud, a heat CCS power plant that is now scheduled to come online in Norway in 2029. But Norway's emissions are not on track in comparison to some other European countries. Together, Europe has the ambition to reduce emissions by 55% in 2030 versus 1990 levels. And you can see here the top line where Norway has significantly increased its emissions in contrast to some of the other European countries or Europe in general. The main reason for this is, of course, the activities on the Norwegian continental shelf and oil and gas exploration and the gas turbines that produce significant amounts of CO2. But with declining activities and decarbonization efforts, Norway is almost managing to catch up at the latest stage of the forecast. But it is extremely challenging to do so. So looking at the trajectory, we see that by 2030, Norway manages to reduce its emissions by about 30% in 2030, and going to 2050 by about 75%. The ambition is to reduce 90 to 95% by 2050, so relatively far off the target. And it's of course challenging to do anything with this because the Norwegian energy system is very much based on hydropower and clean electricity. So whereas other European countries have the potential to reduce significant emissions in its power sector, Norway have to attack the difficult sectors like transport, manufacturing, oil and gas production, and agriculture. But going forward, it manages to achieve 85% reduction in 2060. But it's very, very difficult to do something as we see it in the short term. So if I sum up this situation and these highlights, I would like to conclude by presenting these 4 highlights from this year's report. First and foremost, we see that Norway's energy transition is slowed by the significant change in the geopolitical climate, where the rest of the world is fragmenting and considering higher costs, tariffs, trade barriers, etc. That is creating uncertainty in the future investments, especially in renewables. Additionally, we see Norway taking national priorities like electricity prices, welfare, nature versus climate discussions very seriously, and therefore also creating uncertainty about the potential for investing in the energy transition. We see electricity demand is outpaced by new supply. So wind we see as the only scalable option, and that leads to a deficit in the early 2030s, significantly high probability for increasing electricity prices, and it's only by 2040 with relatively large amounts of wind that have been built where the electricity prices again stabilize. But in this meantime, Norwegian industries have to survive. The third highlight is that energy exports are pivotal in the short term for Europe, but in the longer term, we see a sharp decline and, of course, has quite a significant impact on the state finances. Which leads me to the final point that I just mentioned, that Norway is not on track to achieve its stated targets without extensive use of carbon credits. Thank you very much for the attention. I hope you have a good day.